welcome to another UHURU event. We have so many fantastic UHURU events this year. We just had Dr. April, who just blew our minds with her mind. And it was just such a revelation, particularly about the Eastern Cape. But that was so exciting. Now I'm very, very excited to introduce someone who I refer to as my intellectual Beyonce. I almost want to say Dr. Sisonke Msimang because that's how she operates.
It will never happen.
But Sisonke Msimang, who is so brilliant and so poignant. And I was just thinking of the first article that I read from Msimang. It was a requiem to the ANC. And after that, I was like, run, don't walk to everything else she's ever written. Because it was the most, yeah, it was all of it. I just don't even know, she's done everything. She's written everywhere. On The Guardian, I'm sure most of you have seen her work in the Daily Maverick. She's a really prolific thinker, particularly about masculinities, particularly about white masculinities, black masculinities. I think she's had some really poignant conversations about sex. She says that she writes about money, power, and sex. There's some really interesting, fascinating work that she does, and it's always nuanced, and it's complicated, and it's measured. And I don't think enough South Africans are measured in their critique or in their understanding of this country, and I think it's such a joy to have a Black woman who really positions herself in that way, and it's exciting. And she was also the Ruth First Fellow last year, and she did an extraordinary job with Lebo Mashile. So she is, in my mind, all the beautiful words and all the beautiful books. So, Sisonke.
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Desi, and I'm very pleased to be sitting next to a 2016 Ruth First Fellow. Pleasure to be sitting next to you and to meet you. And thank you to Richard and to UHURU for hosting me. It is very fantastic to be here because this is a space that we hear about and you kind of see its name in the ether, and so it's wonderful to see it and to see that it's a house. That feels very appropriate for what's happening in this place, in this center. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. So I sort of hastily put together a title and then had to work to write something about the title because they were asking me, what are you going to talk about? And so the title came first and the words came later, and usually you want the words to come first and then the title to come. So that's like tip number one for whoever's going to be in the writing workshop tomorrow. But you know, Muhammad Ali is dead, and so it feels like a particularly nostalgic moment. And so in some ways, I think what I wanted to do was reflect on the kind of sentiment, what nostalgia means to us in South Africa and our contemporary politics right now. So that's what I want to talk about. An impossible situation, the politics of nostalgia in contemporary South Africa. So a few weeks ago, I was in Franschhoek at that festival. When Eugene de Kock was unceremoniously booted out, and I was talking quietly at the bar with my friend Palisa Murudu, who is a writer, and she came in and looked very concerned, and she said, "Come, let's go talk." And so we went to the bar, and we started to talk, and she started to explain to me that she had been sitting at a session earlier in the day, and this man had walked in, and he had sat in the seat right next to her, so where they were sitting. And it was him, Eugene de Kock, the man who had killed her brother. And in 2014, de Kock had helped the missing person task team that government had set up to track down activists, anti-apartheid activists whose remains have still not been found. And de Kock had come out, looked for him, and remembered where Elias's remains were, and so he had helped the missing task team to find him, and they had finally buried their son. So Palisa finds herself sitting right next to him, close enough to touch, close enough to punch, I suppose. And so there we have it, a brother's murderer and his survivor forced together by the compromises that South Africa made in order for our democracy to look the way it does today. So the murderer obviously has no idea who he's sitting next to. He's listening intently. The survivor has always wondered what she would do in this situation. And as they listened to the proceedings and the descriptions of what he had done, because the book being discussed was a biography that's just been done about him, about the murderer, she began to cry. And as she wrote in her piece in the Daily Maverick, which if you haven't seen is really worth reading, she noticed that he was having a little cry as well. That's how she puts it. And so afterwards she stands up and she said, she described to me feeling literally physically shaken, you know? Just not knowing what to do, you know, with her body. And so afterwards she thinks, what should I say? Should I introduce myself? What should I do? What do I do? And so she decides, no, she's gonna approach him. So she goes and introduces herself. And he says, yes, he does remember her brother. And I'm sure he does, because de Kock has an incredible memory, right? He remembers all the people he killed. And anyway, he's the only one who told us what he did and admitted that he did what he did. So then he said, yeah, I know who you are. And then he said he was very happy that he could help her family. So of course, as she's telling me this story, there's now another drama that's unfolding in the center of the room. So I had been in that central kind of dramatic place with like the kind of literati, black young things sort of, and you know, Palisa had said, come, let's go talk. And so in the center of the room, Lauren Bucas she's written about how she had walked over to de Kock and asked him to leave, and she has written that she did so on behalf of the black writers in the room. I was one of them, but we didn't talk before she did it. So Bongani Madonda has then written to say that black writers don't need white writers to speak on our behalf, and I agree. And he also said that there was something in the self-righteousness of the moment that kind of rankled him. And in any case, as it happened, de Kock left without a fuss. So there we have it, the long shadow of apartheid, casting its pall over the literati who had believed for a moment that we were a rainbow. So when I told a friend, an American friend, this story a few weeks after the event, his response was, wow, that's pretty much the definition of an impossible situation. Right? That is an impossible situation, to sit right next to the killer of your brother, and then for him to say, I'm happy that I could help, which is also true. And yet, he also killed your brother. So, in many ways, it summed up South Africa and the impossibility of what we have been living through for the last decades, right? So we have a past that's both a trap and a cage, and yet even in moments like this, there are seeds of possibility. In the week following the event, there was lots of articles. Palisa's piece came out, and then Lauren's, and then Bogani's, and there was outrage on Twitter. And Palisa's quiet acceptance of the fact that de Kock has as much right to be in Franschhoek as de Klerk was met with respectful disagreement. I saw an exchange between Eleanor Sisulu and herself, in which Sis Eleanor said, why are ZAPU prisoners still in jail when de Kock is out free? Right? So there's all of these very complicated layers of questions that this impossible situation, an intimate situation, kind of brings up for us. And so these words, all the words that have been spoken, Bongani and Lauren and everyone, continue to provide me, I think, with some evidence that when faced with the impossible, South Africans have always been able to talk and to act and to imagine our way out of trouble. And in part, I think this ability to muddle through heartbreak and imagine a shared future has been based on what we remember, what we know ontologically and in our bones and in our bodies and in our memories. I think we're invested in the future because history has been so bitterly cruel in this country. And I think we've had very few other options but to dream forward. So I want to talk today about nostalgia about its role and its force in present-day politics in South Africa. And I decided to focus on this because in my writing and my columns, I mean, I haven't been writing for very long in the kind of public domain. I guess it's been about 4 years. But after the first few columns, I began to realize that I should probably be defying my editors. So the editor will always tell you, write 600 to 800 words, max. Nobody's going to read any more than that. And after a while, I realized that if I wrote less frequently but wrote longer, then I could fudge the word count. And he was like, no, it doesn't work that way. You need to keep it short. And I don't, right? I refuse to keep it short because I feel like there's more to say than what's in the headline, and that if you insist on writing what one of my editors calls writing to length, you write to the point where the idea is finished, then you cut back. And so I try in my columns to look at what lies underneath events, what's happening to us and through us in ways that the headlines don't always reveal, and I don't always succeed, but I think with time I'm finding myself much slower I'm less prolific, and I'm finding that these days, part of what's happening is that there's a lot of political, I never know how to say this word, so you'll have to help me pronounce it, detritus in our politics. I should have practiced that before I English. So all around us, I think these days we see fights over symbols and heroes, over the past and its weight and its heft and its bloodiness. And it's tempting, I think, to suggest that these competing narratives of nostalgia are only about history. And I would argue that that isn't the case, that our nostalgia holds within it many future possibilities. And so that's what I want to talk about. So it's true that often in the grumblings of white South Africans, we hear too much yearning about the efficient old days. There's a fondness for those old days that kind of wipes away the crimes against humanity that were carried out in service of those queueless post offices and quiet and fully stocked libraries. And it's not just some whites who indulge in this sort of sentimentality. Obviously, leaders of the ruling party also offer their own forms of nostalgia, glorifying fallen comrades and heralding days gone by. The public too is seized with nostalgia. We love Nelson Mandela. We missed Thabo Mbeki. We remember when the rand was 7 to the dollar. We reminisce about the World Cup. Even the DA agrees with loyal party members. I saw funny ANC. So I have wondered lately whether we are reaching backwards in search of meaning because there's no unifying myth to replace the idea of the Rainbow Nation, right? So what do we have in its absence? And so I think in the presence of a kind of hollowed out credo of non-racialism that doesn't have any content anymore, it had a very powerful and important content when it was imagined, right? It was an ideal that we needed to fight for because this was a highly racial South Africa. So the idea of a non-racial South Africa was very powerful and very important. But in the last, I think, 5 to 10 years, it's become void of meaning because we need to think beyond what that means in a free and democratic South Africa, right? So non-racialism needs to be updated. It needs an upgrade or some I don't know, something needs to happen with that. And confronted by the dearth of national leaders, I think that we are turning to sentiment and nostalgia and sort of comfort, right? Maybe. But I also want to believe that certain kinds of nostalgia, when they're mobilized in the right ways, can save us, right? So I don't reject nostalgia. I know that progressive left-wing people are always very skeptical of nostalgia. So I'm kind of going against the grain of what the rest of my politics believes, but I want to kind of redeem nostalgia. And I think that in many ways, nostalgia is already being used as an energy source, as like dark matter that unlocks the imaginations as this new generation finds itself living in a post-apartheid colony, even as it's being mobilized by the old and the decrepit to hold up a range of dying and dysfunctional projects, right? So in other words, I think I want to suggest that nostalgia itself is agnostic, right? That its danger lies in attempts to mask it rather than in nostalgia itself. And that when we recognize it, when we can see that nostalgia is operating, then that's when we're safe. And in fact, that's when we can do a lot with the sentiment that it calls us to use. So let me say that a bit more clearly. So defining nostalgia, Svetlana Boym has written deeply and eloquently about nostalgia. She suggests that, quote, unlike melancholia, which confines itself to the planes of individual consciousness, nostalgia is about the relationship between individual biography and the biography of groups or nations, between personal and collective memory. Yeah? It certainly didn't start out this way. Nostalgia came into use in the late 1600s when a Swiss doctor called Johannes Hofer combined two Greek words, nostos and algos, to describe the pain that results from a desire to return to one's home. So he believed that nostalgia was an actual medical condition. So when in its early life, nostalgia was a medically described and defined illness with physical symptoms. And it was thought to affect people mainly from the mountainous regions of Europe. The fact that Dr. Hofer, who coined the phrase, considered previously existing terms to be inadequate and felt the need to create an entirely new word, a word that in turn gained increasing currency in Europe, suggests that something new, a new way of feeling or a new way of thinking about an old feeling was entering the world. Yeah? So nostalgia inserts itself into Europe in a time and a manner that's distinct to modernity. One could not be nostalgic if one had never actually left home, right? So you've got to be home leave home in order to miss it. And it's a condition that requires disruption and movement and the kind of chaos that I think capitalism and globalization have wrought. By the 18th century, then, nostalgia is no longer confined to the medical arena. It's a sentiment. It begins to occupy a place in the emotional life of Europeans. Nostalgia thus becomes a label used to define those who fall outside of the modern framework. And people who have fallen outside this framework, people who would have been labeled as nostalgic, would most certainly have included peasants, urban migrants, and displaced Africans in the New World, slaves. And so over time, progressive political thinkers have been very suspicious of nostalgia. I've said this already. Marx famously wrote, we suffer not only from the living, but from the dead. The living are in the grip of the dead. This idea was to represent a significant thread in his thinking, right? It comes up time and again in his work. He asserts, the social revolution of the 19th century cannot draw its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it is stripped of all superstition about the past. Earlier revolutions required recollections of past world history in order to dull themselves to their own content. In order to arrive at its own content, the revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead. Right? We've heard this phrase before. So of course I read this with some skepticism as a post-colonial subject who knows all too well about how traditions of feeling and emotive expression have been undermined by white supremacists and determined to be irrational or anti-intellectual, right? So as an African, I know that relationships to time and space have always meant that the living and the dead coexist. The dead are always with us, in some ways never fully buried. In many African traditions, of course, what Europeans would have deemed to be nostalgia when they encountered it, when they heard our songs and our weeping and our remembering, simply would have been a matter of memory, living side by side with the present, a case of ancestors speaking and those in the now listening. So for this reason and many others that are rooted in the complexity of modern-day South Africa and our relationships with the more recent past, I want to make a case for nostalgia. As Jacob Dlamini illustrates so wonderfully in Native Nostalgia, it is possible for Black people to look back on their lives under apartheid with nostalgia, without this being a betrayal, right? Indeed, nostalgia allows for a richer and more human account of the past, which is sometimes necessary and important for ourselves right, as black people. So you remember what it felt like to grow up, right? So that apartheid doesn't become this totalizing experience where everything was terrible and life was just so awful and we didn't live and we didn't love and all of those things, right? So that's why the notion that Dlamini talks about in Native Nostalgia is such an important one. It kind of reaffirms for ourselves our humanity. And so it reminds us that we lived in spite of the impossibility of that situation of apartheid, right? So nostalgia is almost always an intimate exercise. We remember together the things that we loved doing, the things that we did. And in remembering out loud, we reclaim a certain spirit. We yearn for a flicker of strength or hope or humor. Nostalgia is ours. No group but the in-group, whether it's Jews in exile, whether it's Black South Africans, whether it's any group, right? The in-group only can own those emotions and sentiments to which nostalgia is linked. And that's a powerful and affirming, right, experience. For white people in South Africa, I think the contradictions contained within nostalgic moments are starker and less easily resolved. Can white South Africans remember their lives under apartheid in ways that affirm their own humanity and do not automatically stain the memories of black compatriots? Right? So that's a complicated one. So what must they do with the laughter and the love and the birthdays and the happiness they experienced while apartheid was firmly in place? I feel like this begins to get us to the crux of the difficulty, the impossibility of having people who lived through apartheid still with us, right? Not bad people, not, right, regardless of their politics and what they think, but the memories of having lived and loved and done all the things that normal people do while that was happening. It feels like an impossible thing to remember nicely, for lack of a better word. So in South Africa, nostalgia, like everything else, is deeply raced, and so it's always political. And I would imagine that even the memory of ice cream, okay. Even the memory of ice cream eaten on a hot summer's day by a white child whose nanny stands right at the edge of the frame is laden with guilt. Does the white child who is now grown up yearn for a return to that era? So that's part of what's contained in nostalgia, right? One would hope not. But even so, her yearning for that moment can no longer be innocent. Apartheid looms far too large for that. This ambivalence, I think, has to be encouraged. We must keep our eye on white nostalgia as a form of accountability, as a shield against privilege and comfort. White nostalgia should not be driven underground, but it cannot be allowed to rest easy, because it tells us so many important things. White nostalgia allows us to look at white people's fantasies about the past. It lets us be voyeurs, and for those of us who want to be supporters of our white compatriots, as white South Africans struggle with how to be now, after the rupture of 1994, nostalgia is also important, right? So I don't assume that the stance towards white South Africans must be antagonistic. And when I say that I think it's important to examine white nostalgia, it's not necessarily from a needling point of view, although it can be. But I think the discomfort is important, right? It's important to trouble white nostalgia in a way that's different for black nostalgia, for obvious reasons. Yeah? So reinforcing this, two people whose names you will see when I publish the paper, because they're very difficult to pronounce, because they're Eastern European. Maya Nadkarni and Olga Svenko note that, quote, both the meaning and significance of nostalgic practices only emerge from within a field of larger possibilities. Nostalgia is never longing for a specific past. It is about longing for longing's sake. Nostalgia is safe because the object of desire is deemed to be irretrievably lost. Right? It's gone. And so that's what's so nice about remembering certain things, sometimes. But there's two forms of nostalgia, which we want to talk about now. I feel like I'm talking too long, so I'll speed up a bit. So, Svetlana Boyne points out that there are two types of nostalgia, the restorative and the reflective. So, restorative nostalgia stresses nostos, home. So it attempts at reconstructing the past. So restorative nostalgia, as a shorthand, is the one that we need to worry about. because that's the one that seeks to bring the past back into the present. Let's do things the way we used to do them before. That's restorative nostalgia. And the nostalgia that is less problematic, I think, is called reflective nostalgia. And that dwells on ambivalence. It dwells on longing and belonging, and it doesn't shy away from the contradictions of modernity. So restorative nostalgia protects absolute truth, while reflective nostalgia calls it into doubt. That's like the kind of typology. And if we accept this, then we have to look at how, then I think it forces us to look at what's happening when people kind of remember things nostalgically today. And it helps us to see what's what when we invoke the past. Whether it's black people or white people doesn't matter. What matters is what's the attempt. Is it an attempt at restoring the past, or is it an attempt at reflecting on the past, right? So if we think about this campus, if we think about Rhodes Must Fall and the acts that are associated with addressing the crisis of South African universities, then we can look at these as an attempt to smash restorative colonial nostalgia, right? That's saying we don't want the names of these buildings. We don't want this space to continue to reflect a restorative sense of bringing the past into the now. Why is it still here in the now, right? So that's what's happening there. At UP, at UFS, Stellenbosch, I think we've seen Afrikaner nationalism rear its ugly head and use nostalgia as a key device, right? Again, an example of restorative nostalgia. The South African flag, the singing of the stem, all of that stuff, we recognize it's a crude attempt at that. And it always pretends that that's not what it's doing, and that's the interesting thing about restorative. It says it's doing something else. I'm just celebrating, I'm just, but in fact, what it seeks to do is bring in an old regime. You could argue that if you went back to Marx and his instruction that we let the dead bury the dead, that in the past year black students have been in conversation with the dead, that they have reached out to them and deliberately remembered them. Trevor Ngwane has this wonderful quote that, and this lovely metaphor, and he talks about the spirit of Marikana as an animating force that kind of hovers over our contemporary politics. And if we think about the spirits of people who were destroyed by these places, by the frontier, by the kind of colonialism that happened in this place we are talking about, then if we think about what students have been doing across this country as a conversation with the dead, a refusal to bury the dead, and an embrace of the ways in which Africans live, or certainly used to live, with the dead side by side, I think it's an interesting and useful metaphor. I want to talk a little bit about Jacob Zuma and maybe end there, because I think he is like the PhD in struggle nostalgia. Like that guy is, he is like summa cum laude, right? So the politics of Uganda, I think, is obviously a politics of lying and obfuscation and all that, so on and so forth. But the facts of Jacob Zuma's life lend themselves to the kind of nostalgic practice that the ANC has perfected in recent years. So the facts about what he has done, people like Kebi and Jimmy Manyi and all of those might be laughable in their defenses of the president, but their allegiance to Zuma is not entirely misplaced if we think about it nostalgically, right? So I said here he's a magna cum laude of the Graduate School of Political Struggle. His biography is littered with nostalgic signposts and remarkable triumphs. Like many of our parents, he never achieved more than a standard 2 education. This is not something to laugh at, but to actually applaud. His father died when he was very young, and so like millions of black South Africans, he was raised by a single mother. As a boy, he was a cowherd. Again, the experience that has been shared by many, many rural people in this country. Then, he was an early member of Mkhonto weSizwe. He operated within the country. He's arrested in 1964, and he serves for 10 years on Robben Island with Madiba, okay? Another star. Exiled in Mozambique and Swaziland in 1975. So he then also goes to exile, right? So he's Robben Island, he's exiled, he's MK, like, tick all the boxes. Like, this guy is like pure gold in terms of like the struggle, right? Where wasn't he? So I was just talking about it, and someone was saying he's like the Forrest Gump. There he is! There he is! Wow. Amazing. It's actually amazing. And then in 1975, they sent him to Swaziland, and he's there right in time for 1976, when all these waves of students begin to leave the country. So he spans many decades and many generations of ANC, right? So he's his own age, 70s. Then he knows the Madibas who are in their 90s and the Sisulus who are like 90 years old. Then he knows the kids who are coming out in 1976 who are people now in their 50s. Like, no wonder the guy's boss, right? He knows everybody. He's been there and done a lot of stuff, right? So he's been on the front lines. And so I think that faced with the impossible situations that some of us in this room will never face, he fought and imagined his way out time and again. In the first half of his life, he used his imagination in service of freedom. And today we have ringside seats as we watch him use his imagination in service of his own personal desires. So what do we make of this? What does it teach us about nostalgia? That in the person of the president, we have such rich material on which to attach our memories, both positive and negative. In the life of one man, we see authentic and selfless leadership, and deeply problematic, inauthentic and selfish leadership, right? One guy, an impossible situation. And that's why I feel like we're stuck with him. We don't know what to do. And that's why we don't know what to do about the ANC. It's an impossible situation. Indeed, President Zuma's time in office has created a sort of mass nostalgia, right? We're all missing President Mbeki. Across racial lines, right? Forget the AIDS stuff. I think if we turn to look at the number of political leaders who have attacked women for daring to speak about sexual harassment and assault, and if we think about what the students on this campus have been doing in the last few months in insisting on stripping their bodies naked, when queer bodies on this campus protest rape culture, what they're really doing is finding a way into the present by entering into conversations with the dead. These women remind us that in 1929, there was a women's war in eastern Nigeria. They reached for a time when our hero, Ikona Enya, and her comrades in Nigeria were able to meet the impossibility of colonialism with their bodies and protest naked against the tax regime, right? So they remind us that nostalgia sometimes gives us the courage to look an impossible situation in the eye, and they meet that impossibility with their bodies on their own terms. That's what's happening at Rhodes when we are talking about the reference list. Yeah, that's an interesting and important form of nostalgia. So I want to end by reading a little piece of folklore, and it's my favorite piece of nostalgia because I think it's important and it's powerful, and it helps us to tap into the possibilities of nostalgia. It's from a children's book by an African-American woman called Virginia Hamilton, and it's called The People Could Fly. They say the people could fly, say that long ago in Africa, some of the people knew magic, and they would walk up on the air like climbing up on a gate, and they flew like black birds over the fields. Then, many of the people were captured for slavery. The ones that could fly shed their wings. They couldn't take their wings across the water on the slave ships. Too crowded, don't you know? The folks were full of misery then, got sick with the up and down of the sea, and so they forgot about flying, and they could no longer breathe the sweet scent of Africa. Say the people who could fly kept their power, although they shed their wings. They worked along with other folks in the field. All the workers heard the sting of the overseer's words. They all felt the snarl of the driver's whip around their legs. They all felt their clothes being torn to rags and their legs bleeding into the earth. Then one day, one of the slaves started talking about, the time has come. He raised his arms out to the others, and he sighed at the ancient words that were a dark promise.